I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio, where we tell stories about the surprising ways that sewing impacts our lives. Hey everybody, welcome to episode number 37 of Seamwork Radio. Today we're just going to bring you a quick episode with lots of tips. It was inspired by a video that we have on our YouTube channel called 3 Tips to Make Paper Patterns Last. And we put out that video a while back, and it's on our YouTube channel, which you can find at Seamwork Video if you want to check it out. We'll also put a link in the show notes. But there were some great tips in that video that we wanted to revisit. And then we also thought of a few other tips that we wanted to add in and wanted to share those as well. So that's what we're going to be talking about here today. So if you have paper patterns, whether you have digital patterns, you have tissue patterns that you want to preserve and make sure that they last, this should help you do that. I personally use a lot of digital patterns. What about you, Haley? Do you use a lot of tissue patterns or do you use a lot of digital patterns? What do you use more?
These days, definitely digital patterns. When I first started out with commercial patterns, it was definitely a lot of tissue back then. Digital just wasn't so much of a thing back in those days. But now I really only use tissue when I'm working with a vintage pattern.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. When I started sewing, it was many, many years ago, so there weren't digital patterns, and I sewed with a lot of tissue patterns. And then I got really into vintage patterns for a while, and I used those almost exclusively for a number of years. But now I think almost everything I sew, unless I'm going back to my vintage patterns, is usually digital, I'd say. And do you think about, when you're sewing with digital patterns, do you think about saving them or preserving them, or do you just kind of use them and then recycle them when you're done?
I definitely preserve some of them, but only if it's something I know I'm going to use again. I think a number of years ago, I got into the habit of saving every single digital pattern I printed. And realistically, I only revisit about 20% of the patterns that I sew. So I'm a little bit more selective these days. And I only really save things that I'm going to make again or is a really good base to iterate off of and hack. What about you?
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I save patterns and then don't use them as much as I think I'm going to. But I do definitely save some of them. I like to keep them around. I think once you've sewn something, it's, especially if you make any kind of adjustments to it, or if you just really like the way it fits or is easy to put together and you wear it a lot, it's nice to have that without having to reprint and cut everything all over again.
Yeah, for sure. So let's dive into these tips. So first, we're going to cover the 3 tips from the original video that you can find on our YouTube channel. Tip number 1 is transfer your patterns to cardstock or oilcloth. I think this is really great for those patterns that you want to iterate off of and you're going to trace often to hack, because cardstock and oilcloth are really awesome for tracing because you have that nice hard edge to trace off of. And then tip number 2 for digital patterns. Ooh, I said that funny. Digital patterns, print them wide format and then hang them on pattern hooks. You can watch the video to see these hooks in action if you're not familiar, but essentially it's a hook like you would see on a hanger you'd hang a garment off of. There's a little cord attached to that with a metal stop, so you can punch a hole through your patterns, feed the stop through, and you can then hang your patterns, and it is revolutionary and such a space-saving way to save your patterns. We store our patterns this way at the studio, and we fit tons and tons and tons of patterns onto a garment rack.
Yeah, it's really nice to be able to save space that way. You can just fit so much in such a small amount of space. And if you don't have a garment rack, you can even hang them on a hook on your wall or a few hooks on your wall. You can even kind of stagger the hooks, and you can fit a lot of patterns that way.
You would be amazed with how many patterns you could store with an extra, put aside a foot of your closet space and use that for storing patterns. You'd have pattern storage for years, I'm telling you. It's that good.
Yeah.
And then tip number 3 from our original video is to reinforce your patterns with interfacing. Be sure when you're using this technique that you're using low heat and no steam so you don't distort or burn a big fat hole in your paper pattern. That'd be a bummer. And also to clarify, the type of interfacing you'd want to be looking for is the fusible non-woven interfacing, the stuff that's really, really inexpensive that you typically use for more craft-oriented projects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When we were talking about this earlier, I was thinking about those reinforcement rings you can get for loose leaf paper when you put your paper in a binder, because the holes are really big stress points and they can tear. So I was thinking it would be probably a good idea to use a little bit of interfacing. If you're not going to interface your whole pattern, you could use just a little bit of it to reinforce the area where you punch the hole in the pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. Or on pieces like neckline facing, smaller pieces that tend to get ripped a lot easier. That would be a great, more isolated situation. I know that in the garment industry, lots of times most places hang their patterns on pattern hooks, and oftentimes they'll use a piece of cardstock or oak tag to reinforce the point that they're punching the hole through. So kind of backtracking to that tip, definitely thinking about reinforcing those holes is an even better way to add longevity to those patterns.
Yeah.
So on top of those 3 super awesome tips, which Sari and I were chatting about this episode, we came up with 4 bonus tips, which I'm also going to share with you. Bonus tip number 1 is fold up your patterns and place them in a large envelope. Sari, I know that you do this.
Yeah. So I have a lot of vintage patterns. I have a huge collection. Well, I don't know if it's huge. I'm sure other people have bigger collections than mine, but I do have a lot of vintage patterns, and I've always had trouble refolding the tissue patterns again and getting them into the little envelope. The envelopes are small. Sometimes the vintage patterns have even smaller envelopes than modern commercial patterns do. So what I've done is I bought clear bags and boards for comic books. So you can get these online at a comic book supply place of any, online comic book stores often sell them. I bought them in bulk online. I'll see if I can dig up the link and put it in the show notes if I can find it. But if not, you can just Google for this. But they're basically just clear bags, and then they have a piece of cardboard that goes in the back as the backing, and that keeps the whole bag nice and stiff. It makes it a lot easier to put the pattern into the bag, and your entire thing, the envelope, the pattern, the instructions can all fit in there. And it's really nice. It keeps them preserved. It keeps them clean. And because of the board, you can actually put them into like a box, like a file box type thing. And I have mine organized by decade. So I have dividers in between, which I think I also bought from the comic supply place, dividers in between for each decade. So you can just kind of look through them and everything stays really neat and really organized and really well preserved, as long as you keep them out of the sun.
Yeah. And the way that she has these stored is just so visually pleasing and delightful to browse. So if aesthetics, even when you're organizing, are highly important to you, I recommend this method for you.
Yeah, it's really fun for the vintage ones, especially because I feel like it's like a time machine going through them and just seeing the fashions change over time. It's really cool, really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And then we have bonus tip number 2, store your patterns in an artist portfolio. If you've ever taken an art class or sketching class, you've maybe toted one of these around. Essentially, it is an enormous manila envelope with some handles on it. Basically, the less you have to fold and unfold your patterns, the less stress you're putting them under. So a big, huge portfolio like this is going to save your patterns all of that stress. So could be a good option for you. Bonus tip number 3, roll those patterns up and store them in a cardboard poster tube, which you can then label.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
I like that one. I keep all mine rolled up, and there was this tip and snippets. Snippets is our weekly newsletter if you're not on it, and we send out all kinds of sewing tips on there. But a few years ago, we had one to take the cardboard from your toilet paper roll. So when you're done with your toilet paper, just take the cardboard roll and cut a slit in it lengthwise, and it acts as kind of like a little cuff that you can use to put around your rolled up patterns and keep them organized. And then you can, with a Sharpie, you can label it and keeps everything kind of neat and tidy. I did that for a while, and I like the idea of having it in tubes instead, because I just think that would you could fit a lot more in it. And I think it would just be a lot more visually pleasing than an old toilet paper roll would be.
Yeah. I mean, even the magic of spray paint isn't going to disguise the fact that it is a old toilet paper roll. It is a good tip though. Man, I forgot about that Snippets tip. Snippets has some solid tips. If you don't subscribe to that, you should definitely get on that mailing list if you like sewing and sewing tips. We'll put a little link in the show notes for that as well.
Yeah, it's fun. We also send out our weekly videos on that mailing list. So if you want to watch all our videos, which have even more tips, then it's awesome.
Don't miss a beat. Don't miss a sewing tip.
Tips all the time. We're crazy about tips.
I think we're ready to film our used car style commercial now.
Come and get them.
All right. And then last but not least, bonus tip number 4 is trace any tissue patterns onto sturdier paper. We talked about cardstock and oilcloth earlier, but we thought it was worth mentioning that practically any paper is sturdier than tissue paper. So tracing those tissue patterns onto things like standard dot pattern making paper, big sheets of butcher paper. Sari had mentioned before doing paper grocery bags. Mm-hmm. Anything's better than tissue paper. So if you know you're going to use it time and time again, get it off that tissue paper and onto something at least marginally sturdier than that.
Yeah. Yeah. I like butcher paper for that. I think that's it's usually wide enough, the kind that you buy in big rolls, like for kids' art classes and things like that. It's usually wide enough to work for most patterns, not all patterns, but most patterns.
Yeah. I use it for all of our pattern hack videos. It's great for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, anything's better than tissue.
I'm kind of curious about the history of why patterns are printed on tissue paper. I mean, there are benefits when you're working with a print. You can see the print underneath, which is really nice for print matching. But there's a reason. There has to be a reason we do it on tissue paper. But
I would think the reason is tissue paper can be folded really small.
Yes.
And it can be shipped very cheaply. So I'm guessing that's a big part of why it was used.
Must be.
There must have been, the folding machines must have been in existence for some other purpose. Maybe they were, I don't know.
Newspapers?
Yeah, newspapers, although, I don't know, the fold is smaller. I don't know. But anyway.
Yeah.
It's very economical.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Well, those are our tips for keeping your sewing patterns alive. So just to recap what we talked about, recap all the tips that we shared today, the first 3, which are in the video that you can find on our YouTube channel. And again, the name of that video, let me look it up here. The name of that video is 3 Tips to Make Paper Patterns Last. And that's on our YouTube channel, which is called Seamwork Video. So you can find it there. And again, we'll put a link in the show notes. But the tips from that video are to transfer your pattern onto cardstock or oilcloth. And then for digital patterns, you can print them in wide format and then hang them on pattern hooks. And again, just go to the video if you want to see what those pattern hooks look like and how that works. And you can reinforce your patterns with interfacing as long as you use low heat and no steam. Or you could just reinforce parts of the pattern if there are parts that seem prone to tearing. So those are the tips from the video. And then the ones that we wanted to add that might be helpful to you are to fold your patterns and put them into large envelopes. And the ones that I like are just clear plastic bags with boards that are used for comic books, which keeps everything really neat and organized if you're using a lot of tissue patterns. Although I think you could probably use these for paper patterns or, the digital patterns, printed digital patterns as well. You can store them in a big artist portfolio, which keeps them flat, which is nice. Or you could roll them and store them into cardboard poster tubes, which you can then label. Or you can trace your patterns onto some other paper other than cardstock or oilcloth, butcher paper or big rolls of bond paper that you can buy. They're pretty cheap. You can even buy those on Amazon. Or even, for smaller patterns, you could use old paper grocery bags. So those are some of our tips for keeping your patterns safe and making them last a lot longer for those tried and true patterns that you want to sew a lot. Another thing that you might want to check out, we have a thread on our community. So if you're a Seamwork member, we have a thread on there titled How Do You Store Your Patterns? We'll put a link to the show notes for that, where people are discussing how they store their patterns, and there's some great ideas there. So if you want to read that, or if you have your own idea that you want to contribute, How Do You Store Patterns is the name of the post, and we'll put a link in the show notes. Cool. Well, that's everything. That's all of our many, many tips today. But if you liked this episode, we would super appreciate if you would leave us a review on wherever you're listening to the podcast. We're actually doing a giveaway all through May 2021. So when this episode comes out, we're doing a giveaway. And if you leave a review on your podcast platform of choice and then visit the URL that we're going to put in the show notes, then you can let us know that you left us a review, and you can win a year of Seamwork membership. So if you want to leave us a review, we super, super appreciate it. It really helps us. It helps the show. It helps other people to find us. It's the number one way that you can show us that you care about the show and you're enjoying it. So again, just leave us a review and click the link in the show notes to tell us that you did, and you'll be entered to win. So that's it for us today. Thanks for listening, guys. We hope you got a lot out of this.
See ya.
Bye. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the Seamwork community, and you can find us at seamwork.com. If you have a story to share, send us an email at podcast@seamwork.com. We'd especially love to hear stories from those whose experiences often get left out of the conversation, whether because of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, age, or any other reason. Again, that's podcast@seamwork.com. You can find us on Instagram at Seamwork and Seamwork Video on YouTube. We'd love to invite you to join us at seamwork.com. We have an amazing community there, as well as new sewing patterns and classes each month for members. Podcast listeners can get 50% off our unlimited membership, which gets you unlimited downloads from our library of over 150 wardrobe-building sewing patterns. Just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find that link in the show notes. And if you like this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast app of your choice. It really helps other people to find the show so they can hear these stories too. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with you soon. I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio.